Gauge. I want to show you how to read gauge and impress upon you the importance of reading gauge and doing a gauge swatch. For some knitters, it seems like doing a gauge swatch is like eating broccoli is to kids. And the issue is it's really not that hard. It gives you a chance to get used to the yarn, to check out the fabric, you know, whether you like the density of the fabric at the gauge for that pattern. And really, it only takes 10 or 15 minutes to knit up a little swatch like this. So I really want to impress upon you the importance of doing this. Now, the usual rule of thumb is if your gauge is 4 stitches to the inch, you would cast on your gauge 4 times a 4-inch square, because that's usually how we talk about gauge in knitting patterns. But I prefer to cast on a 5-inch square because I don't like reading my edge stitches because they curl even once you've blocked the gauge swatch. I just like to ignore them. People's tension is odd around them, and so I would say if I was trying to confirm a 4-inch gauge, I would cast on 20 stitches. 4 times 5 is 20, and I would knit in whatever the pattern stitch is. In this case, we're going to look at stockinette stitch. So this swatch has 20 stitches cast on. Once I have knit up 3 to 4 inches, I stop. You don't want to read gauge down at this bottom inch because you are still too close to the cast on row. You also sort of haven't gotten into your groove yet, and so it's better to get, you know, at least a good 3-inch height to measure an accurate gauge. So then you need to block this swatch because blocking can alter the gauge pretty dramatically. So if you just knit it and you read your gauge on an unblocked swatch, the reality is once you knit your garment, you're going to block those pieces either before you assemble them, or you're going to block the finished sweater or garment. And so if you read your gauge based on an unblocked square, that's really not so accurate. So do 5 inches worth of what you think your gauge is going to be, knit it for 3 or 4 inches, block the square, and then read your gauge. Okay, so this is how to read the gauge. So I'm going to line up the edge of my 0 next to or right against the edge of a knit stitch. So okay, so I start by lining up my ruler or my tape measure, my straight edge, whatever I'm using, so that the mark of the 0 is right up in line with the edge of a knit stitch. And I'm not using this very edge knit stitch. So you can see my 0 is lined up right here at the edge of this first V. Then, and I want to be sure it's going straight across so that the bottom of my ruler is hitting the bottom point of each V in that row. So I'm reading across in a straight row. Now, as I count, I cover the stitch just because it's easier to keep track that way. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16 stitches, and I've come right to the point of my 4 inches. So 16 divided by 4 is 4 stitches to the inch. So I have here in my blocked piece the gauge that I need for the project that I was intending. Now, just to give you an idea of how important the gauge is, in case you are still unconvinced of the importance of taking the 15 or 20 minutes that it takes to do this little exercise. If you are, say, knitting a sweater, a garment, an adult garment, and you want the chest size to be 40 inches and your gauge is 4 stitches to the inch, that pattern would have you casting on 160 stitches. So say, just for the purpose of illustrating how important gauge is, that you don't check your gauge, or maybe you do, but you think 3 3/4 stitches per inch is close enough to 4. So if you took those 160 stitches that the pattern tells you to cast on, and your gauge is actually 3 3/4, your garment is going to come out a full 2.5 inches larger than you planned on. Now that might be okay for you. Maybe you don't care if it's a little oversized, but if you do care, 2.5 inches is pretty significant. And that's how much larger your garment gets if you're only off a 1/4 stitch per inch, which for most people doesn't seem like much. So take a look at it. If the same scenario, if you're off a 1/2 stitch per inch, that can increase your garment size to 45.7 inches, almost 46 inches, almost a full 6 inches larger than you expected for being only a half stitch off per inch. And then even if you were doing, say, a baby hat, because a lot of people think, oh, well, it's true over a large garment, you know, your half stitch or quarter stitch per inch gets magnified. But even on a smaller garment, let's take the case of a baby hat. Usually for baby hats, we're working with a finer gauge yarn. So say we're making a 16-inch hat, and the gauge is supposed to be 5.5 stitches per inch, which is a typical DK gauge, typical for knitting for babies. That would mean your pattern would have you cast on 88 stitches. Well, if you're off even just half a stitch per inch, that's going to make your hat 17.6 inches in circumference, a full 1.5 inches larger than you planned on. So even on a small number of stitches, you're still going to have a pretty significant difference in your desired finished measurement compared to what you wanted your finished measurement to be. So gauge really is important, and it really only takes, you know, 15, maybe 20 minutes to cast on, knit up a gauge swatch, steam press it to block it, and then count your gauge. And then this is the next important issue that some new beginners or some new knitters have trouble with, is if your gauge is off, should you go up a needle size or down a needle size? So if we want 4 stitches to the inch and we end up with a needle or a gauge swatch that says we have 3 3/4 or 3.5 stitches to the inch, so our gauge is too large, we need to go down a needle size, because a smaller needle will pack more stitches into the same area, right? Does that make sense? So if your gauge comes out too large, you need 4, and your gauge swatch is at 3.5, you need to tighten it up, you need to go down a needle size. On the other hand, if when you measure your gauge it's too tight, so say we had 5 stitches to the inch here, then you would need to open it up more. You'd need to loosen your gauge, so you want to go to a bigger needle size. So